Leighton Smith was a pioneer of talkback radio in New Zealand who now presents a highly popular Leighton Smith podcast. I caught up with him via Zoom last week while I was visiting Wellington. Leighton Smith joins me now from Auckland. Leighton, I'm in Wellington, and since I last came, there seems to be even harder to get a newspaper. The magazine, The Listener, has completely disappeared, and on the radio and television, it's hard to find much, really, apart from NZBC. How different is the media scene here in New Zealand from when you arrived as a broadcaster?
How different is it now? It's completely different. It's peaked and it's going backwards. When I arrived in 1980 for 1 year, how time flies, there were two television channels. There was one news bulletin. There were a couple of newspapers at that stage, morning and evening. They disappeared, well, at least the evening ones disappeared fairly rapidly. And there were a couple of magazines, including The Listener, as you say. By the way, it's still there, but it's under new ownership. In fact,
in print.
When I arrived, my then wife worked at the Listener, but that's just a byproduct of life. The radio stations were very limited. There were about 4. I did a quick count last night of all radio stations in this country, including those online, and there's approximately 154 radio stations. Most of them, of course, very limited in their output. There's a handful of top stations that are nationwide. Those others are generally local, but still, for a country of 5 million people, 154 radio stations is a heck of a lot. To make life more difficult, there is a talent shortage, just about everywhere, but certainly in radio there is. In those days, people would, and I did my first couple of years first 3 years, in fact, in Australia, doing the rounds of the country stations. In this day and age, everything's networked, of course, like it is in Australia, pretty much. Everything's networked. There is no way for anybody to start off in the country on the 6 to 10 shift at night, for instance, then shut the station down and then work their way up, learning as they go, which is like it should be with doctors and nurses and lawyers, as it used to be, because it provided far better results. So
you could repeat that with newspapers, of course. You used to start on a country newspaper and work your way up, and now there's very few country newspapers with employment, and so you basically get journalists coming into the mainstream media, as I guess you're saying, into radio with little experience of the world, let alone experience of broadcasting.
And that's exactly right. And it's amazing those who think in this day and age that they can walk into a, shall we say, a fairly top job with absolutely no inexperience, or with absolutely no experience at all, and then say, no, I don't work weekends, or I don't want to work at night, and blah blah. It's a crazy world. So we peaked with 3 television channels, plus a couple of smaller ones, but 3 major television channels. Then we've got Sky, of course, which is 24/7, taking mostly Australia, with 1 local bulletin at 5:30 in the evening. There, as I say, lots of radio stations. But what's arrived out of all of this is lots of little publishers, smaller publishers. I'll give you one example, NZCPR, the New Zealand Centre for Political Research, which is probably the best of those on offer, especially if you're a right of centre person. The problem is that it doesn't matter which media you look at, most of it is left-leaning. And I could run through, for instance, we had Fairfax here was newspapers, and of course, as you know, they disappeared, sold out, and the main source of news, Stuff, was sold for $1.
This is an online publication. Yeah.
$1, online publication only, and it's got a damn good following, I've got to say, and they're now trying a paywall. NZME has the ownership of the New Zealand Herald, and the Herald has also recently launched an online, sorry, not online, but because that's been there for a while, they launched a paywall. And as I understand it, because that's the organisation that I've been attached to for 30 odd years, still am, as I understand it, it's doing fairly well. The big threat that's coming, and everybody's nervous about it, there's a heck of a lot of stress, I've got to say. The big threat is what's going to happen with the big organisations like Meta, which you're dealing with now over there, with them having pulled out, breaking their contract, obviously. And it's expected that that will happen here. Now, in the last few weeks, we've last couple of months, I suppose I should include, MediaWorks, which was Channel 3, still is, but it's going. And there are a large number of journalists who are going to be hunting for work. Television New Zealand, TV1 in particular, which is the news channel, TV1 is also offloading staff. I think about 50 odd journalists are going from there. And the interesting thing is that instead of applying for jobs in other media forms, like radio, my understanding is a lot of those journalists have had some fairly sizable payouts, and they're all aiming, if they haven't already left, they're all aiming to head off to Europe for the great overseas experience, which I think is crazy, because this is the time when you need to be around to snap up something that is going to take you somewhere, you hope.
Well, here's the point. You have a government in New Zealand like the Ardern government, and because there aren't as many journalists, there aren't as many experienced journalists or journalists with courage, perhaps, turning up at her press conferences, she'll go through the whole thing and get an easy ride. I mean, the same would apply to Christopher Luxon, of course. I guess I'm picking out Ardern because she needed a scrutiny a little bit more. But you've got to have that in a democracy, haven't you? We call it the fourth estate for a reason, because it's there. It plays a function in democracy in keeping the thing on track. So what happens if that diminishes, if you don't have that?
Well, let me put it this way. There's been a great deal of discussion about the government buying out the media. That was the Ardern government. And certainly they did. They had a pot of about 52 million that they distributed, and then they added to that to keep the media alive in times of strife, because advertising fell right off during COVID. And so it was very convenient. Now, there's been plenty of suggestion. A lot of people believe that the government basically owned the media, so to speak, and they were at their beck and call. There is cause to believe that some of that is correct, but I think it's fair to say, it needs to be said, that the media that I was familiar with, was not quite in that corralled position. They were a little more open to sharing stuff that others weren't. Stuff was the worst offender, still is. They put a ban on any but the accepted philosophy with regard to climate change. So any discussion on that got stymied, still is. Same applied to COVID. Now, we know that they made a mistake. They got it wrong. With COVID, we know that ivermectin, which was supposedly banned, at the very least, everybody thought it was, banned in this country by the Prime Minister and the government. Ivermectin has revealed itself now to be a very useful assistant when it comes to COVID and other things, as they're discovering. And there were other products as well, but ivermectin was certainly the most. I did an interview with, and I'm trying to think of his name now, a surgeon, well, a doctor in Sydney, has a practice in the inner western suburbs, who was involved with the two West Australian doctors who brought to light the real cause of stomach ulcers. And I interviewed him because he was writing and talking about ivermectin, and that was as far as it got. He was desperate to talk to politicians here to tell them that they were following the wrong path.
Yeah, I mean, I think
there was no chance of that happening.
No, because I mean, in Australia, the discussion was not exactly free and open, but what you're suggesting is that it was more closed in New Zealand for a number of reasons, including the fact that Jacinda Ardern was bailing out the media with cash, and that may account for why you went so long with that lockdown without seemingly any protest from the population. They were just being fed one story.
Well, don't forget we had the Wellington demonstration that turned into a bit of a riot and disgusted a lot of people. I think they were wrongly judged. The government, including Ardern, made the mistake of simply, because it was out in front of Parliament, she made the mistake of not going down and talking to them. That's really all they wanted. They wanted to talk to senior politicians, and nobody bar Winston Peters bothered to do it. Did him, of course, a great deal of good.
I'll ask a hard question now for me as a man who loved newspapers and broadcasting and cut my teeth in that world, you in radio. Maybe the mainstream media is dying out because it's no longer relevant, because people are watching stuff on social media and stuff. I mean, increasingly young people will sell you their main source of news is social media. Is that the way the world's going? And if so, does that worry you?
Well, I'm beyond worry at this point of life, but it bothers me, yeah, because like you, I'm very much a media person, and media is no good without competition, and it's no good without alternative views. So to answer your question, I think that print is shrinking. It's heading downstream. I'd say that social media is going to lose a lot of its influence. What did I read that the fellow for Meta in Australia said that since COVID, their news attendance has fallen something like 80%. So if they pull out, where are the local outlets going to get their news from?
Yeah. Well, it does become I mean, globally it's a worrying trend, but I guess New Zealand being smaller. But the point is, I'm not sure, Leighton, that it's just a factor of the size of the market, because if you look at Israel, which is a country not much bigger than yours, it's got a vibrant press, still has, that's quite important in the public debate and in holding their government to account. So is it a lack of will by New Zealanders? They're just not really interested in talking about things.
I think I'd say this, that they've got double the New Zealand population. They're around 10 million. They are much more confined than New Zealand. New Zealand's a bigger country and much more spread out. And they're under constant threat, constant attack, and they need to stay constantly alert, as they just learned, sadly. So all of that, of course, inspires a much greater interest, I think, in the public in politics and what's going on. I mean, and already we've got people saying with regard to COVID, it's gone, it's over, forget about it, don't worry about it. It's not going to come back. Avoiding willingly or unwillingly the lessons that need to be learned from COVID and how it was handled.
Well, one more question before we wrap this up, Leighton. So, and I want you to give me a redemptive story here. How do you see things working out from here? Is there going to be a new entrant come in? Is Sky News Australia perhaps going to get serious about covering New Zealand, or do you see any light at the end of the tunnel?
That's a difficult one to answer. Take into account everything that's happened since TV3 got launched, and I was involved with TV3 shortly after it launched for a couple of years. Take into account what happened to it. It basically did reasonably well, and then things started going wrong, and it got sold, and then it slipped further, and it's been losing money for a considerable length of time. Television New Zealand has, I think, announced something like a 50 million loss in the last year. And so the only way they're going to keep going is by being bailed out by the government, even though the government owns the station in the first place. So that's all negative. Why would, and then you've got the rather large financial organizations that bought into TV3 in one way or another, and they've lost money and they're wanting out. So, which is why TV3, why MediaWorks is shutting down in the television business. Anyway, how they'll succeed in what they're going to stay with, which is data, I've got my doubts. So, if you look at that and you've got some money to invest somewhere in the world, why would you choose New Zealand?
Yeah, well, it's a lovely country. I don't know that really justifies the investment, but it is a great country still.
Well, I'm glad you see it that way. I think Australia's a great country too, still.
Good. Well, thank you for joining me, Leighton. I think we've covered a bit of ground there, but more to talk about. So we'll catch up with you again soon, I hope, on ADH TV.
Would be my pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nick.